Okay, well, I make it exactly 6 o'clock, so I think we will start, and I'll keep an eye on the waiting room. Good. Well, it's my very great pleasure to be hosting this talk by Andy Friend, who I suspect many of you will already have heard about. His recent book has had a gratifyingly large amount of publicity, and I'm very delighted that that's been the case. Just to say a few words about the Insiders Outsiders project for those unfamiliar names in the audience today who may not know much about it. It's a project that I myself initiated. I'm a London-based art historian. Way back, actually, well, it was a festival. It was a year-long nationwide festival that took place from it was March 2019 to March 2020 to celebrate across. I mean, it was actually became bigger and sort of better, I suppose, than I'd in my wildest dreams had expected. But it was basically a festival designed to both celebrate but also to analyse and scrutinise the extraordinarily rich and pervasive and long-lasting contribution made by refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe to British culture, not just visual culture, although that's my field, but actually culture across the board. And then COVID struck, as we all know, and like so many people, we went online. And this talk is part of a series that is indeed part of a much bigger sort of ongoing series on mostly online events on themes relevant, both directly and sometimes indirectly, relevant to the theme of the Insiders Outsiders project. So, there's been a break over the summer. Last week we had a fascinating talk on Hans Hess to mark the publication of his selected writings. He was an art historian rather than a practitioner, but of a sort of fervently Marxist persuasion. And it's very striking to me that actually in this autumn sort of season, if I can call it that, there have been, well, I have organised events that sort of mark the publication of a whole cluster of events. Uh, of publications, I should say, that relate to left-wing activism in the arts in the 1930s and beyond, very much sort of spearheaded by, or certainly where the refugees played a very crucial part. And I think that's what Andy is going to be concentrating on today. So we have Hans Hess last week. Next week we have a talk about Edith Tudor Hart, who again is a familiar figure, I suspect, to many of you. And I think, Andy, you may even be mentioning her today, perhaps. All right,
Yep.
but without further ado, I'm
Briefly.
going to say a few words by way of introduction to Andy Friend. He was involved in community politics in the 1970s and worked for the GLC, the Greater London Council, in the 1980s, before becoming chief executive for the city of Melbourne, which sounds very responsible indeed, Andy, in the 1990s. He returned to the UK from Australia and he held senior positions in a number of major infrastructure organisations. And then he changed tack rather dramatically. And interestingly, he published a book in 2017, inspired by his own personal interest in the work of Eric Ravilius, a book entitled Ravilius and Co., The Pattern of Friendship, and co-curated an exhibition that accompanied the project at the Towner Gallery in Eastbourne. And then subsequently, he worked on a similar project, both an exhibition and a book, dedicated to John Nash, not the famous Paul, but his brother, John Nash. And most pertinently, let me just let lots of slight latecomers here. Most pertinently, alongside the book that he's going to be talking about, that really is the reason for this talk tonight. He's curated a fascinating display, and we were complaining that Tate has not perhaps done quite as much to publicise the fact that it's there as they might have, at the Marie-Louise von Motozitsky Archive Gallery. And she is somebody, I don't know, Andy, whether you're planning to mention her, but she was an extraordinarily talented emigré artist herself, and the Archive Gallery is named in her honour. And it's been on for quite some time, and it's running until mid-March of next year. Which is called Artists International, the First Decade. And if you haven't seen it, I really recommend it. It's jam full of fascinating archival and documentary material, and indeed quite a few original artworks as well. There is, of course, this book which came out with Thames and Hudson just recently in early September. And also Andy's working hard now, we were just talking about it, on an exhibition which will kind of intersect with the Tate display, but actually be quite a different animal, I think I'm right in saying, Andy, at the Towner Gallery in Eastbourne, which is going to be called, like the book, is it the identical title? And
Yes, yeah, and similar
Comrades in
title.
Art, Artists Against Fascism, 1933 to 43, which will open on the 6th of May next year and run right through till mid-October. So I'm very much looking forward to that as well. So I think without further ado, Andy, let me hand over to you. kept the slides on the screen incidentally because we were having a few technical issues. So let's hope that Zoom is behaving itself. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much, Monica, for that introduction and for the opportunity to talk to Insiders Outsiders Network tonight. And thank you very much to everybody who's online. I'm going to try and move quite quickly through both talking a bit about the general history of why this extraordinary Popular Front organization is such a significant strand in our history of the period, but also, as Monica said, concentrating on the contribution in particular, well, the nature of its internationalism, which also includes the contribution made by emigrés and political refugees. This image, which I've just put up, appeared in an AI bulletin in 1943, just beyond after For Liberty, the exhibition that is highlighted in the last box. I think it's by Edward Borden. It's unsigned. And I think the reason Borden was a sort of stickler for contractual obligations, and he was a official war artist at the time he would have done this, and just back briefly between two long overseas deployment. But it was the AIA's way of producing a graphic to talk about their history over the 10 years since their foundation in autumn 1933. And I'm going to talk first about the foundation and then highlight a number of exhibitions that took place, particularly the one in 35, very significant one accompanying an artist congress in 37, one at the Whitechapel in the spring of 1939, and then talk a bit about For Liberty. But if you get a chance to look at it, you'll see there are numerous and varied activities celebrated there, and it is in a sense the tip of the iceberg. So where it says something like traveling exhibitions, that underpinning that was a very considerable mass of activity by the time those things were coming around, even in the war years in 1940. But to go back to 1933 in the beginning, the foundation of the AI has a lot to do with the masked figure on the left of this image on the left, Cliff Rowe, or Clifford Hooper Rowe, as he sometimes exhibited as an artist in the late 1920s. He was part of a group called the Emotionist Group that congregated around the Hurricane Lamp Gallery in Chelsea, and was quite interesting. It involved a number of poets and writers and so on. The young Sybil Thorndike hung out there a lot, and so on, and so on. Cliff was a working class kid, basically, from Wandsworth. Mother died young. Father was was very lowly paid worker. An aunt who kept, I think, a corner shop in Latchmere Road. If anybody knows that area of London, looked out for him. Ran a bit wild in the streets. I think not a great attender probably at school, but did go to art classes in the evening at Wimbledon Art College, and from there got a scholarship to the Royal College of Art, where he lasted precisely 2 terms because he was far too challenging a character for William Rothenstein, the then principal of the RCA. So it has a lot to do with his story, and a lot to do with the pamphlet on the right, The Spirit of Invergordon, which related to the Invergordon Mutiny, which took place in September 1931, the most substantial challenge to British military discipline since Spithead and the Nore in the French Revolutionary Wars in the 1790s. And the lettering for this pamphlet, which was the testimony of one of the mutineers done in early 1932, was done by Misha Black, who Cliff had probably met when they were both had a sort of side hustle doing trade show stands at Olympia, but may have met in Covent Garden, where near where they both lived. So Misha Black, who became Sir Misha in 1972 when he designed the interior of the Victoria line, did the lettering, and Cliff did the image. He'd been making, he like many young creatives, quote unquote, of the time, who'd been making their way in the late 1920s. The impact of the Wall Street crash, followed by the slump, and its consequences was such that they began to find that the gallerists were becoming very conservative. The collectors were not collecting because they'd lost a lot of their income. And but Cliff had been making his way as a painter through that group, the Emotionists, and there's still life on the left. He had an exhibition at the Goupil Gallery in Regent Street. The one on the right is, I think, a previously unidentified portrait of Aldous Huxley. We'll have it at the Towner next year. And Aldous Huxley was part of this network and provided the crucial introduction to the 1935 exhibition catalogue, which was a big, as I'll talk about, was almost a coming out into a broader public of the Artists International Association. So Cliff, this was done, as I said, in early 1932. Cliff at the time was having an affair with an older woman doctor called Dr. May Tilney Miles, and everything was going swimmingly for them until hubby cites Cliff in the as a correspondent in the beginnings of divorce proceedings. And basically, they decide to go to the Soviet Union. So just think about the time of 1932. It's probably the point at which the unalloyed attraction of what was going on in the, well, unscrutinized attraction of what was going on in the Soviet Union was at its least complicated. Moscow Metro was opening, literacy was going up, five-year plan appeared to be working in terms of industrialization and a country pushing itself up by, pulling itself up by its bootstraps. Little, if anything, was known outside about the famine in Ukraine. By contrast, here, 25% unemployment, continued benefit cuts, no sign of economic revival. The World Economic Conference, which had been called in London, was about to offset the effects of tariffs on the international economy, was about to fail, as was the disarmament conference in Lausanne. You could go to the Soviet Union at this time, either through Intourist or through the Society for Cultural Relations between the peoples of the British Commonwealth and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And if you look at the vice presidents, this was formed in response to the Zinoviev letter, the big daddy of fake news, which helped to destroy the prospects of the first Labour government in 1924. So there you have some pretty substantial vice presidents and initial sponsors: E.M. Forster, Julian Huxley, Aldous's brother, J.M. Keynes, H.G. Wells, Virginia Woolf, who remained a vice president of this organization up until her death in March 1941. And right down the bottom, L.S. Woolf, Leonard, was, I think, doing quite a lot at the beginning of this organization. So you could get a visa for them. You went down to Tower Bridge, you got on a boat, you went through the Kiel Canal, you land up in St. Petersburg, you get on the train to Moscow, and there's a party, such a party. They get to Moscow and they're there for 6 days, May and Cliff, and he's wandering around, and you couldn't stay beyond your allotted days if you didn't have a job. And you couldn't get a job if you hadn't already got accommodation, and you couldn't get accommodation if you hadn't got a job. That was the way the Moscow authorities were controlling the potential influx of people at that time. And he's wandering around on the last day, and he sees a sign up on the wall which says, in Russian and then beneath it in English, Foreign Workers Publishing Co-op. And he goes in, and on the wall is the design he's done in London. And he says, I did that. And they said, you did that, you're hired. And he works there for the next 18 months, making things like the protection of labour in the USSR slightly more attractive as pamphlets than they otherwise would have been. I particularly like the photo montage glorifying the first business accounting brigade on the right-hand side. But he was doing a variety of these things. He's been there about 6, 7 weeks, and he gets called to a meeting, the organising committee of an exhibition that is going to take place in 1933 to mark the 15th anniversary of the foundation of the Red Army. And they want all foreign artists in Moscow to do something celebrating the class struggle or in their country. He's getting bundles of the Daily Worker into coming in weekly to the office. And what they show at the time of these meetings is the arrival of the hunger marches in London in autumn 1932, when there was 10 days of fighting, vicious fighting, between the Metropolitan Police under Lord Trenchard and the hunger marches. A million signature petition was confiscated, never seen again at Charing Cross. There was fighting in St George's Circus. There was fighting on Westminster Bridge, or in various locations, Hyde Park and so on around London. So Cliff takes these and he puts them into a design for a large mural on canvas, which is intended for being transported around the Soviet republics. And you can actually trace the incidents from the reports into this image, which is massive. It's 3.4 meters long by 1.4 meters high. He never saw it again, but he described it in an interview in the 80s before, saw it again after he comes back in the 80s. And it's recently been rediscovered, actually in Ukraine. And as I said, these incidents were momentous at the time, but to do it, he was part of a group that was, I think, provided with facilities in an old factory, which included Japanese and Chinese artists in precisely the weeks that Manchuria was being invaded by Emperor Hirohito's army. So think Srebrenica, those sorts of massacres from the 1990s. The events that shredded the credibility of the League of Nations because of its inability to do anything about it. He is immensely struck by this, and he writes back to Misha Black in London saying, when I get back, we must found an organization among artists against national hatreds, against fascism and against war. Unfortunately for us, the special branch was already opening Misha's post, so a copy of the letter has actually turned up. And that's an incident, for example, that is taken directly from a photo of something that happened in St George's Circus from the Daily Worker. And at the time, this I think is a wry joke because he's put a self-portrait in, the guy in the blonde hair and the ripped shirt. And it was exactly the time that after the first 2 years of social realism had produced dire results, there were new marching orders for Soviet artists, which included the artists must put themselves at the center of the class struggle. So I think that was Cliff's sort of response to it. Before he leaves Moscow, he meets Pearl Binder there. She's over on a shorter visit. And Pearl Binder, many of you may know, originated from Binderowski originally, from Manchester, had found her way to London, became a very good satirist and a book illustrator. She lived in Bloomsbury and was slightly aghast at all these well-off people slumming it. And you meet them in all the Bloomsbury squares on the left from a book illustration and a fairly recognizable portrait of Lytton Strachey, and on the right they stood round at studio parties talking about it, art that is, and you can see the woman in the foreground has art by Bive Clell, clearly Clive Bell, under her arm. So she had a slightly acerbic view of the Bloomsbury scene, had a short-lived marriage to an anthropologist, Jack Ryberg, who was at the LSE. That split up and she moves to Whitechapel, where she begins to do the illustrations for her own book of London Lives, Odd Jobs, on the left, Whitechapel Bell Foundry, Jewish bookshop in Wentworth Street, on the right in the real East End. So she becomes a very fine lithographer, and this is called Russian Railway Journey, almost certainly done like the others at the Central School of Arts and Crafts in the lithography class there, and it reflects the fact that she made three extended trips to, well, the third was particularly extended for 6 months to the Soviet Union in the 30s, and wrote her own book of Soviet lives, Misha and Masha. Anyway, she meets Cliff in before he comes back, and she says, "Oh, I'll support this when we're back in London, forming this organisation." And she comes back and goes to the class at the Central, which meets on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and is a bit of a political discussion group, now taken by Jim Fitton, also from Manchester, also from a working class background, on the right, and that's Margaret Fitton, his wife, who was a painter at the Slade when they met, and that's them at the British Artists Congress in 1937. So he'd taken over from Hartrick, A.S. Hartrick. He was a star pupil, and he was a painter as well. So he was a good example of a painter who was moving forward at the time of the slump. So he exhibited at NEAC, the London Group, and the Royal Academy, all in 1930. This is Manchester Ship Canal painting. And he was also becoming a very good lithographer. That was in the 1935 AIA exhibition, based on a painting of his, but a lithograph, and a very good designer. And there are lovely stories about each of these images that I haven't got the time to tell you. But Margaret Fitton, his wife, is a really good example, I think, of it doesn't matter how good you are as an artist or how well you're known at the time. And her paintings were written about by critics reviewing our exhibitions like Anthony Blunt and The Spectator and so on. But if your reputation or awareness of your work slips below a certain line of consciousness, becomes quite unknown. There is not a single one of her works in a public collection in this country, as far as I can work out. She's done some marvelous paintings. A lot of them are in a couple of family houses. There are 4 I've put in the Thames and Hudson book. There will be 9 at the Towner next year. This group that comes together as a result of Pearl going to the class and saying, "Cliff's come back, we must go back down to Misha's flat and hear what he's got to say." And then they have another meeting about a couple of weeks later in Charlotte Street. There's basically a group of 20 that form, who are the initial activists, all pretty much in modern parlance complete unknowns at that time, apart from Fitton, who had a more established position. But they include 3 people who they have a number of things in common. They're pretty much all in their 20s, apart from the woman who did this self-portrait, Edith Simon, when she was 16, who was a refugee already from Berlin, and Hans Feibusch, who I'll mention in a minute, he was into his 30s. So they're in their 20s. They're all impacted to various degrees by the economic slump, but they also share, even 9 months after Hitler has got into the Chancellery, a deep awareness about the evil that is beginning to unfold in Germany and Central Europe. So Edith Simon was one of the 3 in that group of 20 who were had come from that situation. The other was Peter Laszlo Perry, seen here in Berlin in the 20s, who was a constructivist designer, architect in the Berlin, I think, Municipal Architects Department, and beginning to be a sculptor. He had to leave when his English wife was found carrying leaflets soon after Hitler got into power. And they were threatened with the child, I think, being taken away, and they had to leave. So those 2 and Hans Feibusch, who'd come from Berlin already, were contributed to the awareness of what was going on, and that became a sort of an important, very early influence from elsewhere. When they were formed, they sort of saw themselves as an artist's auxiliary, basically. If you look at the little signature at the bottom of the Cambridge anti-war exhibition, one of the first things Rowe did when he got back, it says Rowe AI. And I think that's a clue to how they saw themselves. We're members of the Artists International. We're not aspiring RAs. Our role is to be an auxiliary for progressive causes, one of which was the Hunger March, the next Hunger March, which arrived in January 1934, where on a kind of a Gestetner machine, I think, they produced cartoons to greet the Hunger Marchers with information about all the coming benefit cuts. This one by Ardizoni, I think, unsigned, but his unmistakable comic style, which referred to the fact that there was legislation in Parliament that would have set up labour camps along the German lines for the long-term unemployed. And this one I really like. It's by a guy called Roy Laurier, unknown now. I've only ever found one other thing he did. He disappears in 1940. It's unclear why. But this was done at, it's a brilliant bit of on the moment political cartooning. So MacDonald, having split the Labour Party, is there on the right, still on the throne of government. Next to him is Stanley Baldwin, former Conservative Prime Minister, about to become the National Government Prime Minister. His hand is already on the lever of power, controlling the Whitehall bureaucrats who are promoting the new unemployment bill, which is going to force local authorities on the left-hand side to cut benefits to fuel the armaments bin. Behind it, Hitler, Mussolini, in the middle, Mosley for future enlargement, and then the strapline, it's a fascist scheme, which might seem a bit Dave Spart-like until you realise it was done in the week that the Daily Mail was calling for Mosley to be installed as the saviour of the nation, notwithstanding the parliamentary arithmetic by Harold Harmsworth, first Viscount Rothermere, a good friend of Adolph's, as we can see from this holiday snap. It will be very interesting to see where the fourth Viscount Rothermere lines up when the next general election comes around in terms of British politics. But there, at that time, this was the bubble where they were supporting the British Union of Fascists. There was mention of Edith Tudor Hart just now. She joins the group soon after this, because one of the other things that was going on at this moment was the Sedition Act introduced, Sedition Bill introduced into Parliament as a reaction to the Invergordon Mutiny, which would have made it illegal to be in possession of literature which might cause, if placed in the hands of a serving soldier or sailor, might cause them to question their orders. So all of English literature, the Bible, Shakespeare, would have been covered by this definition. There was a massive campaign against it, led by the National Council of Civil Liberties, supported by many people in the AIA. And Edith Tudor Hart, takes this photo at one of those rallies just at the moment that the not so secret policeman on the right realizes there's a young woman with a camera pointed at him. This immediately becomes a trope for the cartoonist. James Boswell is part of this group in Left Review. He'd come from New Zealand, was appalled by the way in which the English upper classes were treating the unemployed, because New Zealand was much more egalitarian at that time. You've got to have, if you were white, you've got to have blue blood, is his take on that on the left. And James Holland, future designer of the floating bit of the Festival of Britain, who came from a waterfront background. This is called The Sailor's Return. So they were the three Jameses: James Fitton, James Boswell, and James Holland, who were with Pearl Binder, were the graphic heart of the 4 years of Left Review. They have an exhibition in 1934 in Charlotte Street, which I won't talk about at length, but is already supported by Paul Nash and Henry Moore. But the crucial developments in 1935 were an opening out. They ceased to be Artists International during that year, noun, communist political formation, and they became Artists International Adjective Association, signaling a broader turning out as they try to reach upwards generationally and outwards politically, aware that they must move out from these, if they're going to be effective, from the relatively small group that they were. And during that year, they get to having 500 members. So this is Betty Ree on the left-hand side, pictured as she takes over as the secretary of the AIA in 1935. She got married to a barrister. She had been at the RCA in the sculpture group where Moore was becoming a student teacher. There were only 11 sculptors there at the time out of 400 and whatever it was people at the RCA, students of the RCA. She has a marriage to this guy, James Ree. Her original name was Bevan. It doesn't last. He's a bit of a drunkard, not a very good barrister. And they have two boys, and she separates. And when they separate, she moves out of a mansion in Belgravia that I think had upwards of 7 or 8 or 9 servants in it, and moves by herself with her boys to a flat in Notting Hill. 1935 was the Jubilee year when the nation was giving thanks to everything that the monarch had achieved for the nation in the previous 25 years. And May the 6th was the centrepiece of the year, where there was a massive Thanksgiving service in St. Paul's Cathedral, preceded by a long procession from Buckingham Palace. But when London woke up on that day, sorry, that's Betty's sculpture at the time. You can see when she was there, influenced by more. She'd left after 2 years and for the marriage and to be presented at court. So when London woke up on May the 6th, the processional route was fly posted with this Cliff Row poster. The police went round ripping it down, but they'd made one very naive mistake, which was they'd put Betty's new address on the bottom. And Trenchard, who was a mate of her father, who was a medic in Harley Street, medic to the aristocracy, goes along to the father and says, "Look what your daughter's doing." He sits down the next day, writes to Betty and says, "The allowance I was going to pay you, now you're leaving James. I'm cutting off. You're never to contact your mother again. You're not to talk to your siblings. You're never to come to our house." I think she sees him once again during his life, before he dies in the late 1950s. But she's a woman of extraordinary strategic sense and courage as well. And it is, I think, she with Cliff Rowe and Misha and James Boswell were key to this opening out I talked about earlier, promoting inclusiveness, organizing a very, very substantial exhibition in Soho Square in a townhouse there, and also editing and publishing 5 on revolutionary art as an adjunct to that exhibition. And that is a very good example of her technique. Herbert Reed had savaged the first AIA exhibition in a review in something called the London Mercury. What's Betty's reaction? Get him in. Let's talk to him. She gets him in. 3 months later, he's writing the opening essay of their collection of essays. The exhibition also signaled not only the change of title, but the strategy which they would apply again and again, including in the formation of the Artist Refugee Committee, which I'll talk about later, by getting in the big names. So they got, and there was a conscious process of writing out, holding meetings, etc., etc. Eric Gill, Duncan Grant, Augustus John, Laura Knight, Henry Moore, and Paul Nash were all names on the London art scene at the time. So their participation was kind of headlined. That's a Nash painting that was in it. But it also embraced things like the fairly young John Piper on the left, Lucian Pizarro, living link to the Impressionists, on the right, who had lived through the divisions among artists around Camille, all the artists we've heard of, who divided during the Dreyfus Affair in the 1890s. And Pizarro is very interesting. He exhibited at every possible opportunity before he died in 1944, after the formation of the AIA, and he went on their advisory council, and was an extraordinarily good participant. Perhaps the most interesting painting do look at the catalogue of that exhibition if you get a chance. It's extraordinary, the work that was in it and the variety. But one of the most interesting is this one by Laura Knight. So 2 months after the exhibition closes, she becomes the first full woman RA of the modern era. When you become a member of the Academy at that level, you give a diploma piece to the Academy. She gave this one called Dawn, a very typical expression of female power in her way that she was doing in that at that time. It was exhibited 2 months before at the AIA exhibition in Soho Square before being presented to the Academy. And I think these two quotes I bring together because I think this signals another aspect of the AIA achievement at this point and their ambition. So Kenneth Clark 2 years into being director of the National Gallery, patrician to his fingertips, writing in the Listener the month before the exhibition, says each group is like a little dissenting sect, sure of salvation while all of the rest of the world is damned. And he's thinking of the 7 and 5. He's thinking of Unit 1. He's thinking of the incipient competition between abstract artists and emerging surrealists. Montague Slater, reviewing the exhibition in the pages of the Left Review the month after it closed, those whom art politics have put asunder, an exhibition against war and fascism has joined together. It is an excellent achievement. And I think at the core of that achievement was the extraordinary growth of an organization started by young people with pretty much nothing, who had incredible commitment and ingenuity and managed to bring in behind them artists of all different aesthetic persuasions, essentially behind not an artistic credo, but behind social and political values at the time that they subscribed to, into a very effective organization. The already that considerable foreign participation in that exhibition. I think the foreign contributions arrived late, so they're not titled in the catalogue. They're just, oh, we're putting them in room G and H. But if you look on the right, also it was part of clearly a wider network of cultural activity that was developing around this time, including the Cambridge Anti-Fascist exhibition. This is designed by McKnight Kauffer. So in the townhouse next door, they have a documentary exhibition, country by country, of what's going on in the populist right and what's going on in terms of the suppression of freedoms. And sorry, not bit wonky thing on my phone, but the one surviving catalogue seems to be in the British Library. But you can see, if you just look at those lists, how they were documenting what was going on in 1935 and going quite deeply into an analysis of what fascism meant at that point. 1935, in my reading of the decade, is probably the last year, if you were a thinking person, in which you could be coherently both against fascism and wholly against war, because 1936 is the year when Abyssinia has already been invaded by this point, but 1936 is the year in which a lot of things change. This painting I won't have time to analyze, looking at when the time's going. It's by Cliff Rowe. It is an extraordinary political allegory of the situation in London. The two clues are Harry's for quality refers to Harry Pollitt, and he's behind the counter. So secretary of the CPGB, and the person dining in shadow in the foreground is Stalin. It's analyzed in the book, and it's an extremely clever painting with some significant figures in it, including, actually, if you look on our friend the policeman from Trafalgar Square and Cliff Rowe's unemployed worker appear in it. During 1936, the AI sent a significant collection of art to the exhibition in Amsterdam, which was the counterblast to the cultural elements of the IOC's collaboration with Hitler in the Berlin Olympics. Including sculpture by Betty Ree, Peter Laszlo Perry, a frieze of a meeting in Hyde Park. We will have quite a lot of Peter Laszlo Perry work at the Towner next year, including very significant pieces from his exhibition, London Life in Concrete, which was sponsored by the AIA, and Nevinson sent the 20th century, and so on. That's a Cliff Rowe one on the left from a contemporary review. But that year, for the AIA's point of view, was a lot to do with Felicia Brown. So people will know perhaps Felicia's story: Slade student, wanted to become a sculptor, went to Berlin, came back, lived in Percy Street, unionized women in the Lions Corner House where she was working 2 days a week, has an older woman friend, Elizabeth Bone. They go off to see the first May Day of the Popular Front government era in France. They then go down to Barcelona, arriving there just before the Workers' Games, the People's Olympiad, was due to open on July the 20th. The night of the 15th, 16th is the beginning of the military revolt that leads to the Spanish Civil War. Fighting in the streets of Barcelona, game's called off, never happened. Elizabeth goes off with Frank Pitcairn, another journalist, to what eventually becomes the Aragon Front. Felicia joins up 10 days later. 3 weeks after that, she volunteers to join a party planting explosives on a railway line, supplying a fascist garrison near Zaragoza, gets killed in that engagement. The body of her and a companion are left there, but they grab her satchel, in which are these drawings, which are currently on display at the Tate, in that display that Monica uh, um, mentioned. They're sent back to London and they become the first fundraising event. An exhibition, a memorial exhibition organized by the AA in Frith Street, becomes the first fundraising event for Spanish medical aid. And they are wonderful, done in a sketchbook with Conte Crayon, in those weeks. Um, Sitting on a beach in Cornwall is Nan Youngman, a woman who'd known Felicia very slightly at the Slade, and not political up to this point, but an expert in children's art and how to teach children art. And she reads the paper in the paper, Felicia Brown killed in Spain, first British casualty of the Spanish Civil War. She thinks, my God, I'm living in history. I've got to do something. She goes back. She goes to Elizabeth Watson. Elizabeth Watson is the woman sitting next to Margaret Fitton on the left of that photo, who's taken over as secretary from Betty at this point. She goes to her flat, knocks on the door. Betty comes out, going out to buy Heinz sandwich spread for the boys' tea, who are upstairs. And from that moment on, for until Betty dies in 1965, they are a couple. They're an extraordinary couple. They do some amazing things. Nan Youngman's a very interesting painter. That's a self-portrait. She is the power behind the Pictures for School scheme in the post-war era, getting real art into secondary schools. She's a very good painter. We'll have lots of her stuff as well at Towner, as we will of Betty's sculpture. So Betty kind of was a full-time activist for several years, and then went back to sculpture in the post-war context in a big way, becomes an important figurative culture at a time when abstraction is sort of ruling the roost, and is a key player in the Looking at People exhibition that runs for 3 years in 2 years in various 3 years in various forms in the late 50s, having originated at Whitworth. 1937 is also the year that they have an extraordinary Congress, partly inspired by what's going on in America. The book goes through the symbiotic relationship between what happens under the New Deal with artists' organization in the States, the knowledge about it in London, and a number of initiatives that come out of that. This poster, which I was delighted to find in a bookshop in Cecil Court when I was idly wandering through it one day, because it's clearly folded up and sent out ahead of time from the Congress, which was, as I say, inspired by what was going on in the US. But just look at that list of supporters, and this is 3 or 4 months before the Congress. So people like Vanessa Bell, yes, but also traditional painters and typographical artists like Badman, Jacob Epstein, whose statues were being daubed by the BUF all over London at the time. Fitton, the one from the core group that was well known enough to appear on this list, really. Duncan Grant, Milner Gray, the founder of the Industrial Design Partnership. Viscount Hastings, assistant to Diego Rivera, came back to London, did the memorial at Marx Memorial Library. Gertrude Hermes, Barbara Hepworth, Maynard Keynes, fund manager and economist, Henry Moore, Paul Mash, Mahaly Naj, Ben Nicholson, the sort of poster child of artistic sectarianism at the time, Revilius, Michael Sadler, former vice chancellor by this point of Leeds University, big collector, Edward Wadsworth, who was part of the group selecting the abstract art to go into the very substantial accompanying exhibition, this time in a townhouse in Grosvenor Square, where they were hoping to hold the Congress as well, which was also the first London exhibition, by the way, of the Pitman painters, suitably enough in the servants' quarters on the 5th floor. But they had very substantial collections of surrealist and abstract art, as well as general art, 750 items exhibited out of 1,500 sent in. This photograph shows Roland Penrose, Henry Moore, both Paul Nash, Henry Moore, and Naomi Durrell selecting the surrealist work. It appeared all over the press in the run-up. They were becoming very cluey, the press nationally and internationally, in publicity and using the papers and so on. But it also alerted the right-wing press. The Duke of Westminster then manoeuvred to get them banned from using property on the Grosvenor estate for the Congress sessions. So they were actually transferred to the Red Lion Square, Conway Hall. This photograph shows Reed W.G. Constable, the founder of the Courtauld, Misha Black, Lord Hastings, Quentin Bell delivering the Education Commission report, and Ronald Kidd, the founding secretary of the National Council of Civil Liberties. It was taken on the afternoon of April the 25th. April the 26th, less than 24 hours later, was the afternoon in which the Condor Legion destroyed Guernica in a delayed birthday present for Hitler. So that situates it in time. There was a very interesting portrait by of Vanessa Bell, sorry, by oh, temporarily another woman RA in that exhibition. And interesting, I think, because um, it there is barely a photograph or a portrait or a self-portrait of Vanessa Bell after the middle of this year, which is the point at which Julian Bell, her older son, gets killed as an ambulance driver in Spain, in which you can't see the sort of pain of that, the legacy of that written on her face. The image on the screen is not as good as the painting. The painting has a sort of slight lyrical quality about it when you see it in the flesh. It's on display in the Tate at the moment. And it was followed by a precipitous events in that so she said goodbye to Julian at Newhaven, quite near where I am at the moment, on the 7th of June. Elizabeth Watson, Quentin Bell, Duncan Grant, and Vanessa Bell go to Paris on the 15th. They visit Picasso in his studio. She says c'est un peu terrible when she sees Guernica in formation, obviously thinking about Julian in Spain. Picasso agrees to come and attend a solidarity rally that they're organizing for the Basque children in the Albert Hall, and he does donate a drawing, but come the day of the Albert Hall rally, he doesn't turn up. But it's the famous occasion on which Paul Robeson, learning that he was not going to be allowed by the British authorities to sing from Moscow to the Albert Hall because they would cut him off, got on a plane, hopped on a plane, flew back, and not advertised, appears in the hall, and sings to the rally. So Picasso was advertised as being there. He wasn't. He sold a lot of tickets, but Paul Robeson was the star attraction on the night in aid of the Basque refugee children. The Whitechapel exhibition in 1939, on the cusp of war. I'm speeding up, Monica. Clearly, this is taken at the May Day rally in 1938, the Surrealists, but the tenor of the times was changing during 1938, obviously with such rapidity. Very significant events like the Modern German Art exhibition, which was sort of coming out party for German Expressionism, really, or Expressionism in general, in London, supported by the AIA, and crucially Ewan Phillips, who was a young man on the Central Committee of the AIA, was the gopher in relation to this exhibition, and the Irmgard, I forget her full name, but who was the moving spirit, was actually living in the Phillips household, I think, at the time. The German embassy alerted the Chancellery in Berlin about the exhibition, and the day after it opened, Hitler made that famous speech denouncing it, material to the story of why the AA felt it had to go undercover rapidly after Dunkirk for a bit. So I won't talk many of you will know about this event and its significance. 1938 and the Artist Refugee Committee, I do want to talk about a bit, Monica, because it kind of intersects directly with the project of Insiders Outsiders, and the I'm not sure whether people can see it, the very magnificent essays in the book that you edited as part of and pulled together as part of that project. What I couldn't understand about this story when I started following it was how come you can understand the AI went until 1971 when it had a gallery in Lisle Street behind Leicester Square. When it closed down, all the records go to the Tate, where they've been in cardboard boxes mainly. Um, You can work out from the material there what the AI was spending on postage stamps in 1941 because the checkbook stubs are there. But for the glory days of the things that are in that graphic, there is no full run anywhere of all the bulletins they put out. We know they put out over 100 bulletins and newsletters. There are big absences in the kind of archival record. I couldn't understand that. I could kind of understand why academia and institutions, for different reasons, are gun shy when it comes to issues of power, politics, and inequality, although they're kind of getting used to talking about issues of gender and race. But I couldn't understand why the archival record was so slim until I discovered this book, which was in the papers of Morris Kesselman, who becomes a Central Committee member later in the war and then chair after Misha. And it's a ledger which is the handwritten records of 60 meetings of the AIA Central Committee, which took place between the week before Munich and the beginning of the intense phase of the Blitz in autumn 1940. It is research gold dust around so many of the initiatives, from traveling exhibitions, how they socialized, through to their political ambitions at various points. And October the 25th, 1938, not a well-attended meeting. Normally about 14, 15 people on there at Central Committee meetings. There were only 8 there. They included Ewan Phillips and Misha and Tisa Hess, interestingly, and Nan Youngman and Betty. Is the Czech refugees on the bottom left. An appeal is to be made in the bulletin for people to offer temporary hospitality to the large number of refugees who were arriving in England in the next week or so. This hospitality, etc., be organised in groups, and Nan Youngman's addresses to be used for AIA members. Betty Rees to write an artist organisation in Prague whose aims are similar to those of the AIA and Ask in blah, 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 blah. And then from pretty much every meeting from weekly onwards, there is something about this initiative. Czech refugees on the 8th through the 11th, letter received. Stephen Bone and Roland Penrose has sent reply asking for details of artists who would need to come to England. Letter as it stands is to appear in the bulletin with appeal for funds and offers of hospitality. Betty Rees stressed need to raise money from all artists' organisation, and particular mention was made of the supporters of the organisers of the recent German art exhibition. It was agreed that the provisional committee, i.e. Stephen Bone and Roland Penrose, should continue working upon this in conjunction with the official committee for Czech refugees. No reply to Betty's role. And then, so that's on the 8th. And then on the 15th of the 11th, we've got Stephen Bone attended the meeting to report. He said that in reply to the letter sent to the Prague, he had received a list of 19 artists who were in greatest danger. More were to follow. After discussion, it was agreed that a meeting of reps from all artists' organizations is to be called extraordinarily by the AI. The 12 people on the proposed council. They were forming an advisory council at this time of the great and the good. And Herbert Reed, Augustus John, Eric Newton are to be asked to lend their names to a nationwide appeal, etc., etc. I think why this is so interesting for people who have examined this is that if you look, for example, at the Anna Muller Harlan's description, the description in the Insiders Outsiders book is more cast in terms of people in Hampstead got together, and then I mean she writes organizations such as the London Group, the Artists International Association, and the Royal Academy were contacted, and they each sent a representative to the weekly meetings. I think a bit of the reverse was going on. There was a conscious decision to use the strategy that they used for now numerous initiatives, which was to not put their own organizational name front and center for everything, but to get significant celebrity reporters. And the last paragraph on the right, the following names were added to the committee that had so far had been dealing with the matter: Kathleen McColgan, Mrs. Ullman. This is the first mention in AIA, the trail of evidence about the AIA of Diana Allman, who goes on to be a major and central figure, not just in the Artist Refugee Committee, but indeed the survival and growth of the organization in the post-war era. Lady Hastings there as well. Lord Hastings often was providing quite a lot of money for these initiatives. Um, so Spain is becoming merged. I'm not going to go through this. The Whitechapel exhibition is very significant and is the ultimate destination of Guernica. Guernica arrives in this country on the same afternoon that Chamberlain is flying back from Munich to declare peace for our time. It's obviously exhibited in a number of places, the last one being the Whitechapel Art Gallery as part of the Food Ships for Spain campaign. A lot of important initiatives, including Portraits for Spain. Ewan Phillips was also a key player in relation to that. They had billboards, which they did live painting on in part of the Food Ships for Spain campaign as the Republic was collapsing. The 1939 exhibition again brought together, like the 37 and 35 ones, extraordinary collections of art. I'm just going to finish on For Liberty. Um, by 19, and this is jumping out, I mean, one of the most extraordinary things about this organization is the way they kept growing and going through the early years of the war, introducing new services for artists, new initiatives, extraordinary exhibitions in extraordinary places like Charing Cross Booking Hall and so on, seen by 120,000 people. By 1943, or end of 1942, people are beginning to feel we're going to win this. What's the post-war world going to be like? And there are two competing visions of that they can discern. One is return to the old social order, Frank Newbold, Abraham Games. Are we going to have health centres and deal with malnutrition and rickets? Misha Black wanted to have an exhibition which would be propaganda of the imagination, dramatizing these choices. FHK Henrion also, had come to this country. He'd been interned, he'd been released, and then both worked for the Brits at Senate House, MOI, but also the Americans, illustrating the ideals of the New Deal. And they become, the ideals of the Atlantic Charter that Churchill had been forced to sign up to by Roosevelt as the price of continuing materiel and military alliance. And they take the four freedoms and use them as the organizing theme for the core of the exhibition. The exhibition was originally called For Freedom. It's now called For Liberty, but the four freedoms become the center. And just to reflect on the interaction with the overseas world, Kokoschka is by now in London and a central interlocutor. He's both the vice president of the Free German League of Culture and on the AI Advisory Council. So there are lots of initiatives that come out of that cooperation. He contributes a very significant angry painting in one of his angry series about the duplicity and the culpability for the war and the betrayal of democracy in Central Europe as part of this exhibition. This one is very interesting. It's called The Death of Gabriel Perry, done by Pat Carpenter, a young man who'd been recruited into the library, had been a student rep on the Central Committee. Gabriel Perry, you can see it there on the left, hanging in the central room. Gabriel Perry, a very fine journalist who'd gone underground, foreign editor of Humanité in pre-war France, member of the National Assembly, went underground when the Germans reached Paris, continued to produce his journalism in Samizdat form, was either betrayed or the Germans got lucky. He gets taken to Fort Valérien and then is given 2 hours notice he's going to be shot as a hostage, writes this extraordinary farewell letter, which is smuggled out to London, reproduced in this pamphlet, edited by William Rust, the editor of the banned Daily Worker at the time. And he becomes, not surprisingly, something of a hero for the people from exiles from the occupied countries. The emotional impact of this painting, as it was displayed in Oxford Street on the John Lewis bomb site where this exhibition took place, is clear from diaries and letters, as is this one by Maurice Kesselman, which I think is very interesting because Maurice Kesselman was not a religiously observant he had Jewish heritage, but he was not by any means religious. He in fact rejected religion in its entirety on rationalist grounds, and you can't find in his work anything that directly references Jewish traditions and practices or the people conceived of in with all religious symbolism. But I think it was the moment that lots of people in London were beginning, they knew and intuited and knew so much more than was being said in official circles about what was happening in the Holocaust. And so he does this painting, which again we will have at Towner next year. It's in the Imperial War Museum and it hangs as part of this exhibition. And again is one that one can see the impact of it. It was fundamentally also an optimistic exhibition in that series. There was a poem by Cecil Day Lewis, who future poet laureate, about each of the core, a line for each of the core paintings in that room. This one by John Tunnard, a pattern mysterious yet lucid, for love is the focal point of the pattern, the penultimate line of his sonnet on those poems. The other one you can just see on the left, a terracotta images. These are children that Betty Ree and Nan Youngman were looking after in East Anglia at the time, and that was the last line. It exists in copper, in bronze form in a garden in North London, and will be at the Towner next year on condition that we give it a good clean. So lots of initiatives in the CIA story during the war about working with people in exile, and the contribution of people in exile to the organization was always going up. So Comrades in Art is a book. It will be an exhibition at the Towner. That exhibition is going to concentrate on 11 of the key people to this story, some of whom I've mentioned tonight. You will get a sense of their rounded sense, I hope, of their life and work if you go to the exhibition, but we will surround that with the great and the good, the single or a few works by people like the Moores, the Grants, the Hepworths. There will be a substantial program of talks and seminars and films, and we will also be doing some stuff about solidarity with galleries in Ukraine as part of that. Sorry, Monica, I've
No, no,
hopelessly
do not
overrun my time.
apologize. No, I'm only sorry I sort of asked you to keep, well, obviously one has to keep something of an eye on the time, but thank you so
Good.
much. Goodness me. Do you want to just stop sharing and let's just leave ourselves a little window of opportunity for some discussion and just, yes,
Sure.
can you stop sharing?
Yep, I can indeed.
I have suggested that people might want to put
Yeah,
some comments or
yeah,
questions in the chat.
yeah.
Particularly since we are a fairly small group, if anybody simply wants to raise a virtual hand and start talking, that's absolutely fine. Let's just go to the gallery view so we can all see each other. Any questions at all? Any comments? I mean, what a rich subject. I always knew it was and wondered why so little had really been done to look at it in detail since really the 1980s when Linda Morris and Robert Radford, as many of you will know, first looked at the subject. And there have been a few, haven't there? There was Christine Lindy more recently, and then you've got Harriet Atkinson with her look at propaganda and exhibitions. So there's a kind of been a growing momentum, hasn't there,
Indeed.
for this kind of material.
And the Linda Morris and Robert Radford work was crucial in catching voices and evidence before it,
Absolutely, that indeed.
dissipated. Mm?
Indeed. Talking of that, I was very intrigued by a mention which I don't think you've brought up in this talk. There was so much to cover, but I think, was it actually in a review or your own words? It talked about a deliberate culling of the records after Dunkirk to
Yeah,
protect the
okay.
CIA.
So
Tell us
what
about
that minute,
that. Yeah.
sorry, can I just address that very briefly? What that
Sure.
book shows is that in the two meetings that take place immediately after Dunkirk, there is a conscious drawing together of records that would identify people, and then a decision to get rid of them. And I think the reason was that they've been so out front in their anti-fascism that in an atmosphere where most people were expecting a German invasion, and most people were thinking a German invasion would probably succeed, that they feared becoming the route for the Gestapo. So for exactly the same reasons thousands that Virginia and Leonard Woolf prepared to commit suicide in a garage that is not 30 yards from where I am now, sitting in Rodmell. I mean, the febrile atmosphere of legitimate fear was leading people to do certain things. And I think that kind of, sorry, I should have explained it in the talk, that book, that piece of evidence within that book kind of explains a lot of the lacunae in the kind of archival trail.
That's really interesting, isn't it? And there was, of course, the Black Book, the notorious Black Book, and Sybil
Yes, yeah.
Oldfield has written a fascinating volume on that. And in fact, there's a talk by her on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel for those who are interested. I mean, were any of the names of the people you mentioned, in fact, in the book? Have you actually looked at
To my shame, I
not
haven't,
yet,
because
but no.
I was sort of up to indexing by the time I became aware of it. And
It's, I mean, there's so, and again, these connections between people, between organizations. And I think there was a review in The Spectator. I was doing a little bit of homework prior to logging in tonight, and there was a nice phrase about encountering new friends or old friends in new places. And I think,
yes,
as the canvas, as it were, broadens and you get some of the much better figures, mainstream figures indeed, of British art of the period, kind of throwing their lot in with
mm,
the AI. I mean, it becomes a even more fascinating phenomenon
mm,
in a way, doesn't
mm.
it? I mean, so very, very interesting. I think we've had one comment coming in, but I think that was merely, not merely, but a thank you and an expression of admiration. Andrew's enthusiasm is overwhelming. I could listen to him for hours. Well, it's quite true. And indeed, I felt there was so much more you could have said. But I guess, one has to say, read the book. It's there with perhaps things still that you wish to pursue.
Mm.
But the book is a wonderful, rich read. And I think you can see from the way that Andy has presented the material that you have a wonderfully engaging way of not talking down in any sense, but actually sort of sweeping the reader up in a narrative that is both very much about individuals and groups, but also setting individual actions against those moments in history which make sense of it all. And it's something you did very effectively, I think, in your talk today.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, listen, I think perhaps we should draw to a close, but I did want to, before I forget, say that Thames and Hudson has kindly offered a 25% discount on Andy's book, and it's a very simple code. It's Comrades, capital, perhaps it doesn't matter if it's capitals or not, Comrades in the plural, 25. And if you go to the Thames and Hudson website and put in the code, it's valid only until the 4th of December, so you have exactly a month to take advantage of that, but you will get 25% off the already, I think, very reasonable price of £40 for a very richly rewarding and fascinating volume. I've
Monica,
mentioned
could I
the
interrupt and just say that it's Jana,
oh
and
Jana, yes, do let's go
and
to the
I
galleries and
thought that was an absolutely brilliant talk. And
where is Jana? I can't actually see you at the moment.
it's okay, I'm
Oh, you're
here.
invisible. All right.
That's
Okay. All right.
fine. It was absolutely brilliant, and drawing all the different
Mm.
groups and individuals together and in context. That must have been a mammoth task.
Well, I was asking Andy before we let you all in, how long the whole project took, and I was, I think, quite surprised to hear that it was about two and a half years in total, which is no small
Yeah, yeah.
achievement given the richness and the diversity of the material.
I should say, Monica, I've had wonderful help
Mm.
from the descendants of many of the
Yep,
people I've
sure.
mentioned tonight, who are pleased that their forebears,
Mm.
efforts are sort of getting a bit of recognition through the sources that you've talked about, and now this. And there was a rather, I'll just pass this on. It was a rather what we had a launch for this book at the Art Workers Guild. So the end of the book is the re-election of the Central Committee in the Art Workers Guild a few weeks after the For Liberty exhibition closes. So it was nice to be able to do it in the same room. But in that room were a couple of people in their late 80s who last met each other at children's parties in the late 30s because
Mm.
their parents were both involved in the AIA. And that sense of and there are I mean, and this is why the sort of collecting of these things and the organization of the evidence is so important. There is a considerable amount of unpublished material still in family collections that needs to be brought into the light and organized, really. And I think a willingness on the part of people who have it to do it. So,
Absolutely. I think I'm right in saying, aren't I, that Tate Britain, I mean, a sort of surprisingly large percentage of their total archives relates to political and or emigré sort of cultural
yeah,
activities and
yeah,
individuals, much of which indeed remains to be digitized, catalogued, put
yeah,
in order.
yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Indeed. Indeed. So, yes, I mean, what more? I mean, yes, get the book, I think is all one can really say by way of conclusion. But also,
Monica,
yes, yes.
sorry
Yeah,
to
and again,
interrupt
sorry.
again. Could you possibly circulate to us all details of the exhibition for
It's
future
all
reference?
it's I mean, Tate Britain is the archive exhibition that's on at the moment in the Motositsky Archive Gallery, and it's the Towner Gallery. I think they just call themselves Towner, don't they now, in
Yes, yeah, it
Eastbourne,
was
from the
recently.
6th of, whatever, was it 6th of May
It's,
to,
yes, it
yeah,
opens on the 6th of May, it
not just
runs
yet.
till October the 18th. It may or may not travel. We're sort of in, negotiation around things like that.
Question from Jane Carruthers, I think it is. What was the Towner chosen for a reason? You live down in that part of the world, don't
Yeah, I mean, the
you?
town was chosen for a reason, and that I was saying to Monica earlier, I kind of what wandered in from other activities into this area, and the town by accident got me in as a replacement speaker quite a few years ago, and that led on to an engagement about Revilius, and they were the home of the Revilius and Co exhibition that then went to Sheffield and Compton Verney, and they have the largest collection of Revilius stuff. So that was a natural home for that, and then and enabled me to work with the wonderful curators there. So this is a project that and they're both. What struck me about both the Revilius network, that was a sort of a group biography of his network, in which of the 15 people I was looking at in core, I realized by the end of writing it, 13 of them or 12 had been activists, and some very considerable activists in this thing I'd never heard of before the AIA. And then similarly with John Nash, there was sort of evidence of activity, and so that kind of made me think there's more of a story here than I'd previously understood. But the town are just the people I've been working with on this stuff.
They're beginning to get a really good track record, aren't they? Even though they're not in
Yeah,
London. Oh, perhaps
yeah,
because they're not in London, of doing some very serious and sort of morally and
yeah,
politically challenging exhibitions. And
yeah,
there was a wonderful one quite recently, curated by Liza Dimbleby. I can't remember what it was called, Drawing the Unspeakable. It was not
yeah,
political, but
yeah,
very much about how art can engage with the most horrendously challenging and of topics,
yeah.
to do with
Yeah, and in a
bodily
different
suffering.
way, Hope Wolf's Sussex Modernism was a really good exhibition this summer.
Indeed, that came to London,
Yeah,
didn't it?
yeah,
So we'll see. So let me just, if I can just reiterate, firstly that we have, as well as the website, and if you're interested in finding out more about future events, do take a moment to sign up to the newsletter. It comes out slightly sporadically, but it does come out. If you go to the bottom right hand page, the homepage of the insidersoutsiders.festival.org website, you can do that in a matter of minutes. And we also have a YouTube channel which has recordings of virtually all the many events now over several years since the face-to-face festival, and a whole array of relevant topics. So, for example, there's a talk on Laszlo Peter Perry, who's a very fascinating and still underknown character, and many other things besides. And you mentioned kindly, Andy, the Insiders Outsiders anthology, which again, there are many overlapping interests and topics there. Essay on Herbert Reed, on Hampstead, on all sorts of other things besides Festival of Britain, you mentioned later, and so on. And just if I can end by repeating that we do have some interesting and overlapping topics in store over the next 2 weeks. Next Thursday, the 13th of November, we have Larry Ray of the University of Kent talking about Edith Tudor Hart, who's a fascinating character, one of the many women who perhaps more than some of the others you mentioned, but she is finally getting the
Mm.
attention she so richly deserves. So that's on the 13th of November. And then also perhaps of interest in early December, let me get this right, the 10th of December, also at 6 o'clock, I shall be in conversation with two authors of recent books, which aren't perhaps as overtly political in their emphasis, but one is the book that's had a lot of publicity, again, by Owen Hatherley, called The Alienation Effect, How Central European Emigrés Transformed the British 20th Century. And also somebody called Bosu Dogromachi, who's at the University of Munich, a new book that's just coming out. And in fact, the Benuri, I see Rachel Dixon in the audience here, is doing a conference just over the next 2 days, marking, prompted by the publication of her book, which is called London Exile, Metropolis, Modernity and Artistic Migration. So I think perhaps in conclusion, I'd just like to end with a comment that's come into the chat, which is something that, had we more time, we could talk about in more detail. But Anne Antrich saying, we need this organisation again today. I mean, it cannot be accidental, can it, Andy, that there is so much interest now in this whole terrain, given the state of the world at the moment. But
It's actually been very interesting how much interest there has been in the States for
right.
obvious reason that cultural freedoms are not in a good place.
It's sad, but
Yeah.
also perhaps encouraging when
Yeah.
one looks at the, as you say, the courage
I mean,
of
just a final comment from me. I mean, I have been asked, along the lines about, what's the relevance of today, and it is difficult to. I mean, so different is the whole culture of art and communication, and it is difficult to think of an easy, an easy transference of specific lessons. The thing that struck me most in following this story was the extraordinary achievement of people with slight resources, but absolute commitment and a great deal of ingenuity. And the fact that they were always looking for the point which would unite people of goodwill in their particular sector. And it was that capacity to build alliances and keep activity going in the most extraordinary circumstances, changing with the drumbeat of history and usually not for the better, that really struck me. And I think they are a thoroughly admirable bunch, basically.
And that seems a wonderfully appropriate note on which to end. So thank you so much, Andy. And I'm sorry you had to keep such an eye on the time, but
No,
you
it's
did
fine. I
wonders. And
feel I
thank you,
gabbled a
everybody,
bit towards the end,
for,
but anyway,
for
thank you
joining
for
us tonight.
hosting
And I
it.
look forward to seeing you on other perhaps related topics in the future. And we have Alan Mann clapping, Stephen likewise. Thank you all for being here. All the very best and good night.